I'm Mike Albu. I'm Director of the Beam Exchange, and it's my privilege to host today's webinar and these four excellent speakers that we've convened to talk about market systems development programming in Nigeria. So I'm going to introduce them all one by one while we wait for other people to join the room. Let me start by introducing Dara Akala, who's the Executive Director of the PIND Foundation. That's the Foundation for Partnership Initiatives in the Niger Delta. And the PIND Foundation works with a range of partners to address systemic causes of poverty and conflict in the Delta. He's joined by his colleague, Precious Agbunno, who is the Market Systems Development Project Manager, and he leads the PIND Foundation's work on using market systems development approach in some of their projects in the Delta. Then we've got Bill Grant, who is the senior expert for MSD in DAI. He's worked on more than 20 MSD programs around the world over the years, and he's served as a senior strategic advisor for the PIND Foundation in Nigeria for the last 10 years, between 2010 and 2020. And he was technical director for the DFID or FCDO funded program in the region called MAID. And so he was helping sort of ensure close collaboration between those two, the program and the foundation. And then finally, we've got David Elliott, who is, he was director of the Springfield Center. That's how many of you will know him. But in the last few years, he founded the Gallus Edge, which is a consultancy using market systems thinking to help the private sector better respond to public policy interests. And in 2019, and the reason he's here today, he led a learning review of the PIND program and the MAID project, the PIND Foundation and the MAID program in the Niger region. So he'll be contributing to the conversation. Okay, so we're well into the hour now. We've got 56 people in the room already. So I think, Bill, it would be a good time to start. Would you like to take it away?
Okay, thank you very much, Mike. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this webinar from wherever you are in the world. I've spent 10 years working in the Niger Delta, advising the two development initiatives Mike just introduced, the PIND Foundation and the Market Development in the Niger Delta project, to develop stronger and deeper market systems to support smallholder farmers, which you will hear about today. In 2010, the Niger Delta was coming out of a decade of conflict, and there were few market actors focusing on supporting the private sector. Most firms were targeting donors, NGOs, and oil companies. This pandemic that we've been suffering through for the past year has led to many unforeseen challenges, causing shocks which have threatened the livelihoods of the 40 million people in the Niger Delta, businesses and farmers alike. As market facilitators, we wanted to see how the systems we've created have been able to adapt to and respond to the shocks in order to continue delivering goods and services needed by smallholder farmers in the region today to stay competitive. This crisis globally has made resilience one of the hottest global topics. How are farmers, businesses, and communities adapting and responding to the shocks brought on by the pandemic to reduce their vulnerability and to continue to be very inclusive? In our analysis, we have seen that having a supporting market system that is able to adapt to the challenges and solve systemic problems is then able to continue to deliver the goods and services needed by the smallholder farmers to make them resilient and able to respond to the crisis. In other words, markets are an integral part of the ecosystem for resilience programming. And well-functioning and adaptive market systems are necessary for ensuring resilience at the individual or household level. The market systems must be able to adapt to and provide support to their members to address a wide range of shocks. Some of the key ones facing agricultural market systems include economic shocks with price volatility for commodities and inputs, changes in exchange rates, etc. Social shocks, political instability, civil strife, unrest, environmental shocks, natural resource degradation, floods, drought, pests, and any range of other natural shocks, and health shocks. Health crises such as Ebola and HIV/AIDS have seriously limited access to labor and cause many other constraints. Though COVID is a health problem, the shocks have been primarily economic and social, due mainly to the government restrictions put in place to prevent the spread of the disease. So how has the system adapted? The next three presentations after this one will explore a number of the characteristics of resilient market systems. These can be categorized into structural and behavioral characteristics, as outlined in a report from DAI in 2018. Some of the structural changes to the system include increasing connectivity, getting more and more market actors into the system, and having them working across broader geographic zones and connecting with more and more firms. Also, diversity and specialization by market actors will be increasing with time. As the systems work better, firms will do where they make the most money. And power dynamics will fluctuate to allow multiple power nodes to emerge. And the last point, very important, is the rule of law across groups is institutionalized with a relatively fair judiciary process. So these are structural changes to the system, but there are also many behavioral changes to the system, where it's really how the market actors engage one with the other. We have good cooperation where firms work together, and these win-win relationships are driven by value creation, value addition. We have good competition, which is based on internally driven improvements to performance using evidence-based decision-making. Innovation stimulates good competition. And business strategy. Firms are now focused on delivering value for customers, suppliers, and staff, rather than just on focusing on how to make more money for themselves at the expense of others. This case on the Niger Delta will show how the market systems became more resilient through our work over 10 years before the crisis, and how with the deeper systems, how the market actors adapted their operations to address the changing needs of the smallholder farmers during the crisis. I would like to now hand over to Dara Akala, who will talk about how we develop those deeper market systems. Thank you. Dara, you're on mute. Dara?
Yes, I'm trying to unmute now. Can you stop sharing, Bill?
I did.
All right.
Stop.
Okay. I'll be on in a second. Am I still on mute? Bill, am I still on mute?
No, we can hear you.
No, we can hear you, Dara.
But we can't
okay.
see your presentation.
We can't see your slides
Okay,
yet, though.
all right.
Oh, we can
sorry.
now.
Here they are.
Oh, great.
Okay. Sorry about that. All right, then. So thanks, Bill, for that excellent presentation laying the foundation.
You've gone on mute again, Dara.
Okay, I'm back on now. Well, it says the host has muted. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, so thanks, Bill, for that firm foundation that you laid for our follow-on presentations. Good morning and good afternoon to all our listeners, depending on where you are joining us from today. My presentation will be focusing on how PIN and maize strengthen the market systems in the Nigeria's Niger Delta region. Now, before I go into that presentation, I'd like to provide a bit of background, to the foundation and the context where we work. Just to introduce our foundation a little bit, the PIN Foundation was established in 2010 by Chevron Corporation with the overarching goal of reducing poverty and conflict in the region. And MAID was a market development program that was funded by UK Aid and implemented by DAI that worked in parallel with PIN's Foundation program in market system development between 2013 and 2019. Now the map to the left is Nigeria, and the bottom part is the Niger Delta region, which comprises of 9 states, the oil producing part of Nigeria, and has a population of about 40 million people. As Bill mentioned earlier on, at the time we started, the development context was the one that was characterized by, the region was characterized by high levels of crisis and conflicts, which led to high levels of poverty. So poverty was both a cause and an effect of conflict in the region. Conflict on its own, on its part, was caused by lack of social infrastructure for peaceable livelihoods, whilst the weak market systems and institutions in the region were the causes of high levels of poverty. So, PIN adopted a market systems approach to implement a portfolio of both economic and peace building programs aimed at addressing the root causes of poverty and conflict in the region. And just to talk a little bit about the peace building program, which comprises of 2 strands: the Partner for Peace Network, which is a platform for local stakeholders to engage each another on an ongoing basis for conflict early warning, assessment, and response. It is a grassroots organization of about over 1,000 volunteers now, and they're spread across the 9 states of the region. And the Integrated Peace and Development Unit supports the P4P and other stakeholders with information, skills, and tools that they need to scale and enhance their peace building effectiveness. So the essence of the peace building program is to provide an enabling environment in which economic activities can thrive in the Niger Delta region, and to ensure the sustainability of PIN's programs in the economic development growth strategy is anchored on strengthening the key market systems that the poor depend on for their livelihoods. Now, to the deepening of market systems, what did we do? When we started, this was the beginning of the journey for market systems deepening. As Bill mentioned, the region was just emerging from about 10 years of conflict and crisis. So we had very few lead firms that are selling to farmers and farmers to processors. So this was what we started, and we went to work. We went to work with a number of business service providers by developing value proposition that would attract many more lead firms, many more input firms into the system, and we gradually started expanding the model. Now, this is where we're at, the stage 3. Here we have much better increased connectivity amongst the market actors. We have better aligned interest of the market actors, and also we saw a deepening of relationships. And then we can say that the whole model is further expanded. And we're working with business service providers at various levels, to provide support and services to the various market actors at various levels in the chain. Now, what did happen as we went along? The metric on the top right-hand shows the changes and transformation in the service providers as we went along. You can see how the outreach numbers increased, how the employees increased, and the diversification of the types of services. And below in the chart, you can see that the local private extension service providers, which are the business service providers, they grew in numbers from less than 300 in 2015 to about 3,000 in 2019. And the outreach grew from about 33,500 to almost 700,000 in 2019. And just to describe the changes that happened as we moved from that weak and shallow market system to a much more resilient one, we saw a change mindset on the service providers because they started now focusing on the farmers. They're targeting the farmers as their market, as opposed to depending on donors to support them to provide services to the farmers, or for government to contract them to provide services to farmers. This was as a result of the training that they received all through the years. Then many more lead firms came into the scene and service providers, and this created competition that led to a lot of innovation as we went along. Then we saw steady increases in linkages between all market actors to reach the smallholders farmers. And finally, on this slide, market actors started influencing government programs, influencing government agencies in how they design and execute programs as we went along. Now, back to the point being made earlier on about structural changes to make a market system resilient. It was talking about the characteristics. What did we find in the case of the Niger Delta region? Increasing connectivity. Local private extension providers now expanded rapidly, working across different geographies, and with over 200% increase in outreach. Now we saw diversity and specialization. Beyond training, they diversified their service offerings to the farmers. On power dynamics, this is very interesting because the master service providers that emerged on the scene, they started interfacing between the farmers and the big input farms, the lead farms, which made transactions to become a lot more efficient, within the system. And then rule of law. This I talked about earlier on. There were informal engagements between the local private extension programs, local private extension service providers, and the central bank and the Small and Medium Enterprise Development Agency of Nigeria in organizing and delivering programs to the market actors in the region. And on behavioral changes that we saw in the system in the Niger Delta region, we saw that a good cooperation was happening between business service providers, the technical service providers, and inputs and technology providers. And this was happening both vertically and horizontally, and driven by value creation and value addition. That was good competition. The system now sees continuous upgrades in products and services. And lastly, business strategy. The local private extension service providers became more entrepreneurial. They knew where to focus in order to make money. So they now focus on delivering value to farmers and SMEs and their businesses. And I'll end this presentation with a quote from one of them, the business service providers, who said to us, "Every problem that my clients have is an opportunity for me to make money providing a solution to the problems." There ends my presentation. Thanks for listening. And I'll pass it on to Precious Agbunno, my colleague, now to speak about the impact of COVID-19 on the market actors, especially the farmers, and how they coped and adapted with the shock. Thank you so much. Over to you, Precious. Did I lose
Did you stop sharing, Dara?
Yes, I've stopped sharing.
Okay.
While Precious is getting connected, I just throw in a quick bit of advice. If anyone...
All right, so thank you, Dr. Dara. I will now present the impact of COVID-19 on the market systems and how the market actors responded to the threats of the pandemic. Good day, everyone. So the first case of COVID-19 was recorded in Nigeria in February 2020. And the set of initiatives introduced by the government to curtail the spread of the pandemic disrupted the operating environment for farmers and other market actors in the region. The first preventive measure that was introduced was an initial total lockdown with movement restrictions. And this disrupted the farming activities of farmers and the field activities of the support market actors. It also disrupted the flow of inputs, bringing about scarcity and leading to an increase in the prices of inputs. It also limited access to market and finance for farmers and support market actors because banks were closed and most of the large buyers were not in operations. People were not moving around, and so they couldn't purchase the basic agricultural goods. So before the lockdown was relaxed, the government introduced waivers to allow agricultural products and market actors in the agricultural space to move around. But it also introduced public gathering limitations. So gatherings were limited to about initially to 50, then down to 20, then to 5. And in some cases, people were not even allowed to gather. And this further disrupted the field demonstrations, the field activities of the support market actors, the service providers, because they couldn't gather enough people for their trainings and demonstration activities. And most times it didn't make economic sense to just train 5 people or 12 people. And so a lot of training programs were canceled. There were other preventive measures that were introduced by the government, including interstate movement restrictions, curfews, and market controls. And all this had varying degrees of impact, negative impact on the activities of market actors, impacting the flow of inputs, increasing transportation costs, limiting the access to labor, and impacting access to market and funding opportunities. So in October 2020, we carried a survey, just a quick survey of about 100 farmers to kind of understand what the impact has been on the market actors. Across the 5 agricultural value chains that we work in: cassava, aquaculture, poultry, cocoa, and palm oil. And the findings were quite interesting. Almost about 84% of the farmers confirmed that they were negatively impacted by the restrictions. In fact, about 74 felt significantly negatively impacted. Access to critical services was seriously impacted. Input was topmost on the list. Access to finance was seriously impacted, and market. And these 3 were the most pressing challenges that farmers face during the restrictions. Information on labor and transportation were also impacted. Farmers' operations were also impacted. In fact, the performance, a lot of farmers complained bitterly. A lot of them experienced decrease in sales due to low demand and inability to increase prices in response to the increase in the cost of inputs. So the cost of operations increased across the sectors due to the increase in the cost of input. And non-profit margin also fell as a result, but not in all the sectors. Some sectors actually witnessed an increase in profit margin. The cassava sector, for example, because of the increased demand for cassava derivative, which helped increase profit margin in that sector within the period. But across board, most of the farmers experienced a decrease in profit margin. And this began to increase after the lockdowns were relaxed. Also, we tried to find out how the farmers try to adapt, try to cope or respond to the challenges. And from our findings showed that about 84% of them deployed different adaptation strategies, mainly working with the service providers to respond to the pandemic. And I'll get to that in subsequent presentation. Our survey also showed that about 53% of the farmers sort of deepened collaboration relationship with the service providers, in particular to address issues around access to information, input, finance, and market. And I will speak a lot more on that too in the subsequent slide. Now, going to the market actors to the service providers. What you have here kind of lays out the different types of services provided by the market actors, by the service providers in the various sectors. And all this were impacted by the restrictions. But most importantly for the service providers is when we spoke to them, they all said, that's the clients were negatively impacted. And sort of this provided an opportunity, for them to adapt the service offerings to address the most pressing challenges that the farmers were facing. It's about input, market, and finance. Because for them, they understand that being able to offer value-added services to farmers will help, secure their own operational survival. So they began to build value proposition, refine the value proposition around linkages to finance, market, and inputs, so the most pressing challenges that farmers were facing during the period. But what were some of the response strategies? How did they really respond? What were some of the adaptations that happened? So there were all different types of adaptations in different sectors, taking different forms and shapes. Most importantly was adaptation of services by the support market actors. So there were quite enough adapted services adapted. An example is the deployment of virtual and ICT platforms and phones and social medias to address access to technology and business information, and to organize training programs. The online platforms were also deployed to address the market challenges of farmers, because as at the time the restrictions were introduced, some of the farmers had harvested. So they had product that they couldn't sell because of the restrictions. And so a lot of them worked with the service providers to help them to implement virtual and online marketing strategies, including selling to their neighbors, identifying buyers within their communities, because they couldn't move and buyers couldn't come from other states or communities to sell, to buy from them. There were also a report of service providers supporting farmers to help them to adopt new storage and processing technologies, as part of their response strategies. An example is in the aquaculture sector. We found that fish farmers began demanding, adopting the use of smoking cans, to smoke their fish and then to sell them as smoked fish instead of selling as fresh fish, because of the lack of market for fresh fish, and also because the technologies were available, made available by the market actors. So in terms of deepening of relationship, and this was also one of the strategies that was deployed by the market actors, to improve their response to the pandemic, to the threats of the pandemic. So a lot of them work collaboratively together to particularly address the present challenges the farmers were facing. An example is in the crop sectors, where we saw deeper collaboration between input companies and community-based agro-retailers and farm service providers to
I'm afraid we might have lost Precious there.
I hope not.
Well, while we just give him a chance to come back, I just want to point out that there's already a bit of a good conversations going on in the Q&A box. So a number of questions have been placed there, and if you have questions for the speakers to address, please put them there, because some of them have been, well, in fact, all of them have had answers from the speakers already, so we can kind of have a parallel conversation going on there. But we will come back to some of those questions when we get to the when we finish the presentations, if we can get Precious back on. But we have actually lost him completely now. So why don't we park that aspect? Unfortunately, it was the most interesting part of the presentations in many ways, discussing how exactly actors in Niger Delta adapted to the COVID shocks. But David, would you mind picking up the baton now, as it were, and carrying on with your presentation while we see if we can get Precious back on board?
Mike, if you'd like, I can finish Precious's presentation.
Oh, okay, Bill. Why don't we do that then? Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes, I think Precious is trying to get back on now. But Bill, if you can, please just jump and carry on.
Yeah. Let me share screen.
And then when he comes back, he can take it over from you again.
Okay. Thought I had Precious's. Okay, can you see that?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so Precious had just been talking about the deepened relationships, especially geographically. There were problems with people couldn't travel across state lines, and so different service providers in different states were able to coordinate with one another to service their clients in the other states. And we found greater specialization. start my video. Can you see it?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Greater specialization. Some of the people who were particularly strong in IT tended to drop other parts and just focus on IT and servicing all the other service providers with IT. There were many new opportunities identified, new markets. We heard Precious mention the smoked fish. We also had opportunities around, in particular for import substitution. Rice was being banned into the country, so there were opportunities to provide more cassava products. And the government did introduce a number of stimulus schemes. And because the business service providers were used to working with the government, they were able to take those schemes and bring them to their clients and show them what they were doing. So how did the farmers respond to the effectiveness of the service providers' strategies? The flow of business information relationship improved drastically, 84% satisfaction among the farmers. They felt they had the ability now to address the most pressing challenges during the restrictions. And there was an effective response strategy. It evolved over time.
Yes, I'm back in.
Okay, well then you go and I'll keep running the slides. And you talk, Precious. Precious, you're on mute.
Oh, so sorry about that. Okay, so sorry that I had poor internet connection. So I'm back on. So the service providers actually utilize a lot of strategies. A lot of them found themselves.
Precious, go to the very end, the last bullet.
All right. Okay. Yes. So, so in looking at the effectiveness of the response strategy of the service providers, we also sort of try to find out how the farmers feel about their response strategies, and kind of this evolved as the service providers understood the problem. But we also understand that not all the challenges could be addressed because some of them needed the restrictions to be relaxed for those to be addressed, and others because of the weak market, weak skills among some of the market actors, particularly in the technology provider space. So talking about some of the factors that enable effective adaptation, one of them, what we did as an organization, because PAIN had to facilitate engagement within actors for problem identification and solution development. And this was important and something that we can easily do because PAIN already, when we're used to external shocks, considering the context of the region. So regular engagement has been one of the tools that we use to stimulate partners to action. And so it was necessary to deploy such engagement here, to be able to kind of engender that wide market reaction to the pandemic. Also, we invested in analyzing and carrying out analysis and reporting on it, and to ensure that all market actors understand the nature of the impact to respond more appropriately. But that wasn't all. There were other market enablers that enabled the kind of response that we saw amongst the service providers. The fact that we have been working with entrepreneurial-driven service providers who have now changed their mindset, to targeting farmers directly. They see, the business proposition, the business value of targeting, huge millions of farmers and not targeting just small donors. And so they know that their livelihood depends on their ability to provide, to address the most pressing challenges of the farmers. There's also the depth of maturity of the market system actors, as witnessed by increased availability of different competencies, service providers who have the capacity and the skill to really facilitate access to finance and market, working collaboratively with other types of service providers to ensure that happens. We saw increased connectivity among the service providers, bringing about an expansion into multiple states and sectors. Obviously, the good competition and coordination has been one thing that has been quite very prevalent among the market actors. And COVID-19 provided an opportunity to even deepen that further. I will now hand over to David to sort of wrap up this whole presentation and to talk about the implication for other projects. Thank you.
Thank you, Precious. Good recovery.
Hi guys, sorry, just bear with me a second while I try and share the right screen. Okay, just confirming, Bill, you can see the screen okay?
Yes, I can.
Lovely. Let me start by saying thank you, Precious, particularly given the technology challenges you had there. So well done for seeing it through. It falls to me to offer some summary reflections on what I'm sure everyone listening will agree were really excellent presentations. Market systems development and resilience, two concepts. Distinct but arguably interdependent. The idea that enhanced market systems themselves can enhance the resilience of those affected by them. I want to draw on the pinned experience to look at what characteristics of market systems development might have enabled greater resilience in this particular context. Firstly, competition and innovation, and starting with the nature of competition, moving from spot to relationship-based trading. Products being bundled into a package of value-added information and advisory services. Models delivered through a network of agents operating in and from local communities. A sense of interdependency and joint responsibility. De-risking through pooling and sharing. A sharp contrast from previous approaches of disengaging and exploiting risk as enhanced opportunity. Secondly, adaptation. Precious gave the example of how community-level kilns, kiln smoking technologies, were opened to and utilized by fish farmers who are now able to preserve and perhaps even add to the value of their fish, which otherwise would have been severely eroded and or appropriated. Trust and choice, a second set of characteristics that I think has helped farmers improve their resilience. Building from the changing nature of competition, being more embedded within and across communities has arguably helped to build trust. Trust that comes from a growing sense of interdependency and fairness. Trust that is arguably a critical foundation to people working together effectively during times of crisis. Choice also matters and is related to trust. Without choice, you move back from interdependency toward dependency, and with that, the risk of undermining trust and reverting to more extractive and exploitative responses. Connectivity and cooperation. Building from the platform of trust and choice comes this third set of characteristics. Connectivity in terms of the network of agents, servicing multiple communities and selling for multiple lead firms. The depth and breadth of vertical networks in value chain speak was arguably critical to enabling more and better communication flows up and down the various supply chains. This improved the flow of two-way information, facilitated better cooperation on issues of planning and decision-making, as well as advocacy and engagement between market actors and with government authorities. Finally, confidence and leadership. This set of characteristics being rooted in the notion of the private sector now leading sector transformation, rather than expecting someone else to, government and or donors. And this shift has given the private sector a growing sense of confidence in and of itself to solve problems and to offer leadership in respect of engaging and advocating between itself and towards government. It knows what it wants, it knows what it needs, and it's not scared to say it. So what characteristics of a market system have enabled greater resilience of smallholder farmers in the Niger Delta dealing with the impacts of COVID-19? Well, arguably things like competition, innovation, trust, choice, connectivity, cooperation, and leadership all seem to have played a significant role. Moving on, I wanted to also reflect on the implications of this to other programs, also working under the veil of the pandemic. Dara presented the 3 stages of market development in the Niger Delta, from very shallow to more enhanced market systems over time. And with this, is the argument and notion of increasing market resilience. And I guess most of you listening are working with programs that lie somewhere on this spectrum, somewhere on this journey of market systems development. And the COVID-19 or another crisis, another time hits, what then? What do you do? Well, I guess you have two choices. First choice is stick with strategy, but accept that tactics might need to change in response to the rapid onset of the crisis. But using your assets, your skills, your partners, your networks, your resources, your convening powers to respond to a different kind of problem. Yes, this might inhibit your moving at least as quickly from step 2 to step 3 in the example shown. And the fallout from the crisis might also knock you back, knock your plans back a little bit too. Partners may fail, priorities might change, but you're still looking and working to develop the market system because you know that there's always crises, and crises always impact more on the poor. And you know that more developed market systems build the kind of resilience, or can do, to better manage and mitigate the impact of crises. The other choice, jettison strategy. Completely repurpose your assets. Change entirely how you work and who you work with. And in doing so, risk distorting those same market systems until now you purported to be supporting. And with that, undermining market system quality and its ability to help the poor cope with future crises. And when expressed, I guess, in these terms, it's not much of a choice, really, is it? Thank you for listening. Mike, I think it's over to you.
Thank you, David. Yes, excellent presentation. Excellent presentations. I mean, it was very interesting listening to all four of you speaking. Before I say anything else, I just want to point out that we have the Q&A box at the bottom right, and there's already quite a few interesting questions there, and this is your chance to add to the list, and I will try and go through them all as much as possible in the time we have remaining, which is about 15 minutes. But thanks again, David. I thought that last point was really crystal clear in a way, and throws down the gauntlet, if you like, to those of us who are struggling, although with how to respond to this crisis and future crises. So to go back to this question, this theme of resilience and what it means, I want to start, if you don't mind, Bill. I'm going to go back to you, and perhaps, and hopefully you can add to what David has just said here. The question we had first of all, we had some questions in earlier from people who registered for the webinar. So we had a question from Elsa Mapilele from USAID in Mozambique, and it's very similar to the question that Misan just posted a few minutes ago in the Q&A box. How do you build resilience into the MSD approach? In other words, Misan said it would be nice to throw more light on resilience as an ongoing behavior from a market systems perspective. So I think there's kind of asking the same question. Bill, would you like to have a pop at addressing that?
Sure. I think that by its very nature, when the market systems deepen and you address those both structural and behavioral challenges, which are the characteristics of an effectively functioning market system, you generate more resilience, both at the sector level, but also resilience in terms of the ability to service their farmers. It's this changing attitude of thinking, who are my clients and what do I need to do to help them? Because if I don't help them, I will not make more money. And if I don't help them, then I have to change my whole strategy. So I think they're symbiotic, in that as you build the deeper market system, you get better relationships, they're better able to work together and to respond to a range of challenges that are brought on by these shocks that we talked about, and will provide greater resilience to the smallholder farmers. So you have both a resilient market system, which adds resilience to the smallholder farmers. Thanks. Mike, you're on mute.
Thanks, Bill. That's very helpful. Let's see if we can get to something quite tangible here. So Andrew Seaward asked a question just now, and maybe Precious, you could respond to this. It's in the chat, in the Q&A box. But have you found certain specific types of service providers being better able to adapt more quickly than others. He says he noticed from the table that the input suppliers seem less able than the BDS providers. What are the specific characteristics that adaptive firms showed? You know, the size, the sector they're in, some other factor that seem to predict whether people could be more adaptive.
So thank you, Mike. Absolutely, you're right, and that was showed in the course of my presentation. Some of the service providers, because they have the skill and the relationships, were able to quickly adapt. For example, the service providers, and it depends on the kind of problem being addressed and the type of skill required. So the service providers, when it came to the business service providers rather, when it came to adapting their services to online platforms, they already have the skills, some of them the skills and the platform and the relationships, so they were quickly able to do that. While that was happening, some of the technical service providers and input companies didn't have that level of skill and infrastructure, but then they collaborated with the business service providers to be able to do that. We saw that the technology providers were not really that quick, fast in adapting some of the strategies, because for some of them they needed to still build a lot more relationships. So it's about skill, it's about more relationship, it's about a better understanding of the problem, it's about how the depth of skills that they already have even before the pandemic. And that is why it's important to continuously support and build market actors and ensuring that they have the skills to respond to such kind of shocks. So yes, right. Some of the service providers were better placed to deal with the pandemic than the others.
Mike, if I can add to that just a little,
Yeah.
I think it's also the entrepreneurial nature of the service provider. I mean, we saw people who, over the course of 5 or 6 years, had started as single consultants. And as they began to learn about how to do business better, they grew rapidly. They hired more staff. They went from 1 or 2 people to 30 people. And they went from a few hundred clients to 3,000 or 4,000 clients because they got it. And they're the ones, like the one that Dara quoted, who said, you know, every problem that my clients have is an opportunity for me to make money. These are the guys who really get it. And so we had 40 or 50 of them who really dominated and who led to a great majority of the increased outreach. But those 50 hired another 10, 20, 30 each, working with them to really expand those services. So it really did develop a kind of a private commercial extension service.
Fascinating. So look, there's a very interesting related question from John Chettleborough, who said, he asked, well, does the fact that the strategies adopted by farmers, which included selling to neighbours, using alternative cheaper inputs, etc., does that demonstrate the importance of maintaining informal channels that support adaptation and resilience within the market system? Or because that seems to be a slightly different sort of strategy, if you like. Would you or Precious like to respond to that? Or perhaps David? David wrote an answer in the chat box already, but I was going to get into that.
Well, and very quickly, many of the people, say fish farmers who wanted to start making their own feed, didn't have the equipment and they didn't have the raw material. So it wasn't simply a question of them saying, I want to start making feed. They actually went to their service providers to say, where do I find the equipment? Who's manufacturing the extruder that I can buy? So yes, they wanted to do it, but they relied on their service providers to help them find the inputs, the machinery, et cetera. So a lot of it does also come from the entrepreneurialness of the farmer. Yeah.
David, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, I think maybe just 2 things. One is the general business model, the point I put in the chat to John, the way in which they move from phase 1 to phase 2, from lead firms operating remotely into these communities, into recruiting service providers from the communities themselves, lead farmers that had an interest in upgrading their activities to take on selling and service provision to other farmers. And that's kind of how the supply model has grown. So all of that is reducing transaction costs through using social networks and investing in them, actually. The related point, I think, is that as you move from phase 2 to phase 3, you're seeing that now these social networks are not isolated. Now they are connected to other actors that play different roles in the market system. So there's many more people invested now. There's a lot more joint responsibility, joint fortunes. And strategically, there's a lot more people that have moved from just seeing it as an opportunity to dump product and sell quick and get out even quicker into those whose futures and the investments they've made are enduring and will last. And therefore, it changes the dynamic from just going in, selling something and getting out into we're invested, we're staying there. How do we make this now work? How do we respond? And so the right incentives are in place, and increasingly the right kind of structures are in place to respond to those incentives. So that would be how I would probably think about it, Mike. Connectivity between different levels, investment, mindset, and actually leveraging, if you like, these social networks and dynamics that clearly exist and are very strong in the Delta region and elsewhere, I'm sure.
Mike, can I add to that?
Yes,
can I add to that, Mike? I mean,
yes,
that underscores the importance of working with entrepreneurial commercial extension service providers, because they're constantly looking for different channels, whether formal or informal, for their services. So what you find actually is that the service providers are constantly looking for opportunities, constantly looking for leverage points, whether it's formal, working with informal channels, and also developing new channels to be able to serve farmers much more effectively. So obviously, yes, informal channels are important. In a market system project, you don't discount them, right? You can leverage them to reach farmers. And that's what we're seeing, play out in the market system in the Niger Delta.
Okay, thank you, Precious. A couple of people have asked questions about the use of ICT tools, digital tools and services, and whether they were a factor, or what advice you might give about how those were used effectively in this context. Edinburgh David and someone called MW both asked us similar sort of questions about ICT, digital tools and services, and whether they were adopted.
All right, thanks, Mike. So we found that the business service providers were quick to adapt the use of ICT tools, online and virtual platforms for their training. So it was a training programs and advisory programs that were quickly migrated to online tools. Of course, the demonstration to farmers and all those in the rural areas who do not have access to phones, that was quite effective for the business service providers. They used that to carry their trainings. In fact, some of them utilize online tools to carry out training, for the Central Bank of Nigeria COVID-related loan scheme to qualify farmers to be able to access that loan. So it was quite effective. For the rural farmers, particularly working with the input companies and community level agro-retailers and farm service providers, it was the connection utilization of those structures, the local retail service providers and the farm service providers working with community leaders and lead farmers to carry out demonstrations and train farmers in the communities. So that was what happened. So yes, the online tools were more effectively utilized by business service providers. It was quite effective.
Okay. Well, look, thanks, Precious. So we've got just a very few minutes left. I wanted to broaden the conversation out a little bit to more strategic issues, perhaps. Dara, one of them, I had a question from, again, in the advanced questions to this webinar from David Rogers at USAID. And he asked, what was your biggest pain point and how did you overcome it in relation to the implementation of this program over the 10 years, I guess?
Thanks, Mike. I think that's a very interesting question. There are several pain points, but to talk about the biggest one, I would say that is the slow takeoff of the program because we were lacking traction. You see, as we mentioned at the beginning, we started at a the post-conflict period. The region was just coming up from about 10 years of conflict, and there were a lot of oil companies in the region and development programs that were throwing money at the problem. So there was already in place and entrenched the direct interventionist approach, right? So when we came and we're talking about market systems and the facilitative approach, this was novel to them, and then it was even strange to many of them. So because they're used to receiving things, free of charge. So it was difficult to gain traction with several market actors. We couldn't convince them easily to participate in the program. Many were very, very doubtful. Some were resistant, and a few were outright, very cynical about the whole thing. So that was the thing we were faced with. It was an issue of competing development approaches. We're practicing a more sustainable market systems facilitative approach, and several were carrying out the direct interventional approach, which was distorting, the market for us. How did we overcome this? With patience, consistency in our messaging, and then staying true to our approach, because we could have been tempted, because if things were going slow, to throw a lot more money at the thing, abandon our strategy, and follow the general trend. But no, staying true to our approach. With time, people started listening to us, and by the time we were successful in bringing on board the innovators, and early adopters into the program, then this began to demonstrate to others that, hey, what we thought would not work is actually working, and can be beneficial in the end. So this attracted many more to join, and that's why we were able to build, a much stronger and a resilient market system in the region. So that's how we overcame that pain point.
Great. Many thanks, Dara. I'm afraid we've almost run out of time, so I just wanted to give one last chance to any of the speakers who, if there was a question that you've seen that you could address very quickly, whether you would just try and jump in and give a quick answer to the last question. Is there any particular question that you'd like to pick up on?
I wouldn't mind just saying one thing quickly, Mike. There's a number of questions about market systems and resilience, and where do they start and end, and is it just a new way of looking at old things? I just have one thing to say. I think there's strong conceptual and definitional convergence between resilience and market systems development. They both concern the capability of market systems, functions, rules, players doing them, to respond to shocks and stresses. Market development has exactly the same kind of definition: the ability to ensure people can live their lives and earn their livelihoods going forward. And that means dealing with risks, dealing with shocks. I think the issue lies in what donors are prepared to pay for in terms of the kind of market system capacity that programs are allowed to build. And Kristen O'Planek has put a good written response to this, where she makes a distinction between focused on risks, mitigating risks, versus pursuing profit. And a lot of donors' incentives are about this profit motivation and looking forward. And the kind of sunken investments you might need to make to build institutional capacity to deal with risks do not necessarily yield the same kind of indicators and the same kind of returns that donors are looking for. And what I think, and I really encourage people to look at with PIND, is that they as a program do have explicitly an objective around peace building. And it's that work that they've done on peace building, which doesn't result necessarily directly in profits and directly in returns to labor, etc., but which is intimately and integrally related to people being able to do that, how they manage risks, how they reduce conflict, all of which sets the foundation and platform for people to build the kind of market systems and earn the kind of income they're looking for. And that's because PIND was explicitly allowed to invest in that and to see that as an objective in its own right. So there's conceptual convergence. I don't think there's much to learn from there. It's how it's applied and what donors are prepared to pay for, and what projects open their eyes to look at as opportunities looking forward, but also opportunities to mitigate against going backwards. Thanks.
Well, thank you. That was a really great way to wrap up this conversation. And I will just take a moment to highlight, of course, the learning review, which you wrote, David, which is available on the Beam Exchange. And there's a link to it in the Q&A chat box now, but also there'll be a link to it in the email that we send around to everybody who's here today, along with a link for the recording of this webinar if you want to listen to it again or you want to share it with any of your colleagues. So can I just take the last chance then to thank the speakers for a really rich set of presentations about what is obviously an extremely valuable program that has done great work in a very difficult region over longer than a decade now.